Can I make an embarrassing admission
Go on.
about the Dominic Raab thing? I never could understand what was that wrong with saying that the sea was closed. I understood exactly what he meant by it. It means you couldn't swim in it because they said it was dangerous, so they closed the sea so we couldn't go in it.
But it's just something quite funny about saying this. And also, if you...
Well, it was closed.
But if you were nose to the grindstone working on the evacuation of Kabul from your hotel room, you wouldn't know about the arrangements for
that's the argument, is it?
Wakeboarding or whatever it was he was planning to do.
I see. That's what everyone was trying to get at, were they? Because there are lots of things that you could say about Dominic Raab, but there's this sort of arose this kind of very odd idea that he was stupid. And I really don't think he is stupid. So the answer to the question of what he's going to do is probably do quite a serious job in the law.
So the reason he's got a reputation for being stupid is he does say stupid things.
Yeah, but that was given as an example.
Well, no, all right, then, but what about saying misogyny is wrong, whether it's between a man and a woman or a woman and a man?
Well, yes,
saying hadn't fully appreciated how close France was to England.
Well, no, actually, what he said, what he actually didn't quite say that. He said he hadn't appreciated the centrality of the crossing. Well, I'm sure lots of people hadn't. I mean, obviously they should have done before they proposed Brexit. I accept that. But I think that the idea that he was stupid.
He said
rather missed the point of him. I mean, I thought he was too right. He's too right wing for me in lots of different ways, and I really disagreed with things like the British Bill of Rights. I thought some of those things, I suppose colloquially you might describe them as stupid, but I didn't think they were because he was thick. Because I just don't think he is.
He said he didn't want to put a border down the Red Sea when he meant the Irish Sea. These are all things off the top of my head.
Well, okay, you can say. I mean, I don't know.
Maybe he just had a habit of saying of misspeaking. Rather than
he does do a lot of speaking though. Yeah. If you're a cabinet minister.
So why is he standing down then, Henry?
Well, I don't completely dismiss his stated rationale, which is that he wants to spend more time with his two sons. I mean, actually, one of the things about that evacuation from Kabul when he was in wherever he was it Greece?
Yes.
Was that. He basically wanted to have the first family holiday he had in a year and a half of being Foreign Secretary. And actually, I remember speaking to someone who'd worked very closely with him during that period, saying the irony was he worked obsessively, insanely, counterproductively hard for his entire period as Foreign Secretary. And then that was the one time he took a break. And the other thing I remember hearing, and this was from someone who had called up to tell me that they thought Dominic Raab was a bully, was that... during his incredibly crowded ministerial diary, the one thing that he would never allow to be moved was something he was doing with his family, be it bath time, be it taking a kid to a football match or something like that. However, in addition to all that, he's clearly going to lose his seat, and I can see why he'd rather start the business of getting in touch with headhunters now rather than in the aftermath of an election.
That's obviously going to be a crucial part of the equation. But then you do also reach a point in your career where you think to yourself, I'm probably not coming back in. Yeah. This probably is a commentary on whether he thinks the Tories are going to win the election, as well as on his own seat. If the Tories were to win the election and Rishi Sunak was still to be Prime Minister, I suppose you'd think there might be a chance I'd come back. He thinks that isn't going to happen. This statement is a statement that he thinks is not going to happen. And so, not being an idiot, he has decided that he doesn't want to stick around for it.
And I suppose, there's also that thing of he's been Foreign Secretary, he's been Justice Secretary, he's been Deputy Prime Minister. Even if he did come back, is it hanging on for the vague possibility of possibly being Transport Secretary?
Yeah. Being a Member of Parliament is very hard on your family life. It's a very hard way of working. I remember going to synagogue, dropping my son off once for a class at my synagogue. And as I was leaving the synagogue to go and have breakfast with a friend of mine, into the synagogue came Nick Hurd, my local MP. And I thought, this guy's got to actually sit through a synagogue service in my synagogue. He wasn't Jewish, that I didn't have to go to. I could go to breakfast, and he was dressed in a suit. It was a Saturday morning. And I thought, oh my God, I can see why my wife didn't want me to become an MP now. It's hard.
No, I mean, look, it clearly is. And I think there's also an extra element to it, which is that it is quite rare. I mean, I can only really think of Theresa May, though I'm sure there are others, that someone who has flown very high in government is willing to hang around on the backbenches for a long time, because I think once you've done that, once you've been at the heart of decision making, in Dominic Raab's case, he was acting prime minister for a month during a public health emergency, the likes of which we've never seen before and probably won't see again for a very long time. Like, of course, he doesn't want to. I'm sure he cares very deeply for his constituents, but I don't think 5 years of only dealing with his constituents would attract him in the same way.
His wife will also probably have had a voice. I met a friend of mine who was a member of Parliament. He said he was getting out of the cupboard on a Saturday morning, a big sign that says "I'm X and I'm here to help." He was going to put it outside the supermarket, and he got it out, and his wife said, "You're not here to help. You're standing outside the supermarket." And that there is a tension between the things that you do for your family and the things that you do in public life. And I suppose he's probably reached the point where the balance has tipped. So I understand that. But clearly, if he thought the Conservatives were going to win the election and he thought he was going to keep his seat, he probably would make it. The large chances he'd made a different calculation. Not 100% certain, but a large chance.
It's probably deprived us as the most likely Portillo moment at the next election.
I think there can be a few of those.
Yeah.
I think there'll be a competition for them.
I mean, the logic of the local elections is that, even Dominic Raab's successor as Deputy Prime Minister, Oliver Dowden, on an extremely bad night for the Conservatives, might even just about be possible. So
the thing about Portillo, I was in Conservative Central Office that evening with the only person who did not suffer a Portillo moment, which was William Hague, as almost everybody lost their seat. And I remember standing near William thinking, you're going to be the next leader of the Conservative Party, because so many of his rivals were falling. And the Portillo moment became important because just as the peak one, but there could have been any number of other ones if it hadn't been him.
Who is the Welsh Secretary now? David T.C. Davis. I think, maybe less likely that the mantle falls to him. But who knows how many will lose their seats.
You never know. What about Suella Braverman? We've been told that she's on leadership manoeuvres, despite the fact that only 27 of her colleagues actually backed her last summer. But we're all goldfish now, Henry, so nobody actually remembers anything that happened as far back as July.
Yes, it's a funny way to mount a leadership campaign, constantly being in the papers for doing things which haven't gone massively well. Look, I mean, it is clearly true, as some of her outriders, allies, sources close to intimate, that were she to be brought down by the current scandal feels too strong, but, run of stories, she would hold Rishi Sunak's feet to the fire from the backbenches. Whether that would be enough to calcify into a leadership bid at least this time of a general election, I doubt very much, because, as you say, her support on the backbenches is quite limited. But there's a difference between the number of people willing to make her Prime Minister following Boris Johnson last year and the number of people willing to join with her in this scenario in making the government's life difficult. And that will be a calculation playing out.
Yeah, and also she's been Home Secretary since that 27 votes, and there isn't the alternative poll of extraordinarily of Liz Truss to attract support. So, so she's in a different position. I think her chances are relatively limited in most circumstances, but they're certainly not non-existent. I can understand why she, sadly, by the way, but I can understand why she harbours an ambition.
How concerned should Rishi Sunak be about another group?
Well, it's not a good thing, is it? And when you begin to go behind in the polls, I remember this from working for John Major, everybody has got a strategy for saving it. It's interesting that Jonathan Gullis talks about a coalition that elected the Conservative Party in 2019, because he clearly thinks only his sort of Conservative and only his sort of seat were part of that coalition. The whole point of coalitions is that they don't just consist of you. And that's one of the things these groups don't seem to appreciate, and they want to pull Rishi Sunak to supporting their particular version of conservatism. That, for those people who haven't read it and are instead making the mistake of listening to us, the article by William Hague this morning about what was wrong with that National Conservatism Conference is totally brilliant. He puts his finger on the enduring appeal of conservatism as non-ideological, and or at least, I know people, strict philosophers will disagree with that interpretation, but but he says that the more ideological it gets, the weaker it gets, and a lot of these groups are making a mistake of trying to sort of seek some perfect ideology, using the idea that they support the Conservative coalition that was supported in 2019, where in fact actually they're supporting a kind of narrow version of it.
Because Henry, ultimately, Boris Johnson's probably the least ideological person you could come across, which is how he managed to straddle that coalition.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I think that was a crucial part of his appeal, as well as his personality, and as well as the fact that it was a straight choice between him and Jeremy Corbyn to be/remain Prime Minister. I think his ideological malleability allowed people across a very wide political spectrum to convince themselves that he would, he would govern in a way that they liked. I mean, I think what is slightly eccentric about the argument advanced by this new Conservatives group is the idea that policy is what might save Rishi Sunak, or rather, sort of government policy across a suite of issues. I think the best way that Rishi Sunak can come up with to win the next election is to address the cost of living, is to make people's lives better in a very narrow sense. I don't think at this point reversing cuts to the size of the army or whatever. And now look, that might lead you to some new Conservative policy ideas. There may be an argument that the tax cuts that they seek is a way to reduce the cost of living, but I don't think Rishi Sunak is going to recover the Conservatives' electoral position by showing people who voted for the Conservatives for the first time in 2019, but look how wide-ranging my policy agenda is. I just don't think that's quite how it's going to work.
Now let's go back to a conversation we touched on briefly last week. We were talking about votes at 16 and Keir Starmer suggesting that he was in favour, or at least we'll look at it. So we asked YouGov to poll the question. And actually, they polled two different questions, giving very slightly different answers. But the public seem opposed regardless. Do you think that 16, 17-year-olds should be given the vote? To what extent do you support or oppose that? 30% oppose. 30% support it, 48% oppose. And when you talk about reducing the voting age from 18 to 16, the opposition goes up a bit. But Danny, you mentioned last week that you supported it.
Yes,
I was quite interested to flesh out why.
Look, it's not as though, like a lot of things, there are, of course, serious arguments against it. So I'm not saying that the argument for it's the only one. But my view is that voting has consequences. Politicians tip their proposals to all vote towards the people who can vote. It's the reason why Martin Luther King concentrated on the power to vote. He thought that was the route to improving civil rights for African Americans. In exactly the same way, I think we need to tip the system more towards the future of the country, towards young people whose support for our basic model of liberal democracy and welfare capitalism is quite weak, and that poses a threat to the long-term stability of the country. I think there are lots of smaller, more instrumental things. So, for example, I think that you might get higher voter turnout among young people if they all were together in education at that point. And I think there are civil rights arguments for it, which is that there's a lot we expect from people over the age of 16. But the most important reason is that I think it will tip the system towards people who've got a long time to go, therefore making the future, a better bet for politicians. I think that would be a good thing.
It's interesting, Henry, that in the polling for us, 48% of Labour voters support giving 16 and 17-year-olds the vote. That's the only group. Only 9% of Tories, 34% of Lib Dems. So clearly they've got a sort of vested interest in this, that young people tend to vote more to the left, and that's why you might expect Keir Starmer to want to expand the franchise.
Yeah, I mean, also, I guess you could say if you're more instinctively in favour of keeping things as they are, then you're more likely to be a Conservative, right? So there's that there. But I mean, Labour voters will think, I think rightly, that this is more likely to produce a chunk of Labour voters than any other party. I mean, I interviewed Keir Starmer, gosh, it was a week ago. It feels about a year ago. I've been to Japan and back with Rishi Sunak since. A week ago. And Steve Swinford and I asked him about this. And I was very struck by, I mean, he did not rule it out. He did not ditch it. And we were also talking about the proposal for votes for EU citizens. But he said something like, look, I've got 5 missions. Those are my 5 priorities. You can see pretty clearly that electoral change, I think was the phrase he used, is not one of them. So if Keir Starmer were Prime Minister for a decade, do I think he might change the franchise? Yeah, possibly. If Keir Starmer were Prime Minister for 5 years, do I think he'd get around to it? Probably not.
It's lucky he didn't make it a vow, then he definitely wouldn't have done it.
I was trying to work out yesterday, the third mission had two shifts to deliver 2 goals to tackle 3 killers. It was very complicated.
Well, as Patrick Maguire and I wrote yesterday, there is a degree of consternation in Labour High Command about the language of the missions and whether, even if it might be a good way to run a government, whether it's too bureaucratic a way to campaign.
But the trouble is he's got to plough on with it now because he's done 3, so he's still got to do speeches on the 2 of the poles of the pillars of the
You're
mission.
always told when you do things like Question Time, for the BBC, for goodness sake, don't say you've got 5 points to make, because the audience immediately thinks, oh God, he's only reached the second one.